Hi, everyone, and welcome to Brother, Won't You Talk to Me, a podcast series about growing up in the 60s, social change, and what it meant from two perspectives almost 10 years apart. I'm Lee Rennick, webcast and podcast host, a woman to our mom, Baba, and I'm so really delighted to welcome my brother to this podcast, Rob Rennick. He's a learner, a teacher, mentor, and an amazing person. Rob, could you introduce yourself?
I am so happy to be here, and it's a wonderful opportunity just to talk about the past and the 50s. I came out of the 50s baby boom, and it's a huge generation that has had a lot of different events happening in Toronto and Canada and around the world. And through those events, I eventually became a teacher in alternative high school, taught for 45 years. Also went to OCA as an artist, have done art, different types of art, including installation and performances. I have a little band that I play with my buddy called the Postmodern Thieves. And now I am, I guess, on this journey after work. So it's been a fun kind of thing. I'm taking a writing course right now.
Wow, you always are involved in inventing yourself and working towards just being who you need to want to be. And we'll talk about that. And I'm really excited to have you on this podcast. And I just want to let our viewers know that obviously our views and opinions are expressed just solely by us. And we are really doing this podcast to share with family and friends our perspective of growing up in the 60s. So I'm really excited to have you here, Rob. We've talked about this a lot for about 7 months. Apparently, Michelle
Uh,
is doing a podcast with her brother. We're a little late. We could have had it 7 months ago. But this whole idea incubated, I guess, from me thinking about like growing up in the 60s. And we come from a family of four. I'm the youngest, you're the oldest. I am like many little siblings who view the world through their older siblings. So you, Karen, and Kent. And those cultural markers of those time frames that you went through, I got to see them from maybe a different perspective. So I'm really excited about this, just to talk about how you viewed things, how I viewed things, and how maybe the 60s really changed the world as well too. So thank you again. When we were thinking about this, I thought, well, you are born in the 50s. And so the podcast one, our first podcast, is called The Boy in the Striped Suit. New Year's Eve, 1959. Okay, so it's 1959, it's New Year's Eve. I was even at that party because mom had me in her belly. You're there in our grandparents' basement in Don Mills with our siblings and family members, and it looks like it was a really fun party, and you're in this great striped suit. I guess you're about 8.5 years old, 9 years old. So
yeah.
maybe we can kick off by just, talking about what was it like being born in the 50s. It's post-war living, it's the baby boom. Like maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, it was a very interesting time, I think, for Canada because it was post-war Canada. And especially in the 50s, the economy of Canada really turned up a dial. It kind of overran even the American economy for a while because there were
Right.
so many resources. And so there was a big change. I was born in 1951 in Toronto at Women's College Hospital. But at that time, that's when the shift started. And my parents lived downtown at that time around the old, I guess, Eastern European area, Lippincott and Bathurst Street, Harvard. And they lived a time in a time where they had homes maybe, but they would have to rent half the home out because they couldn't afford the mortgage. Both partners worked. It was a challenging time after the war a bit until the 50s. And so for the first part of my life, I lived downtown and right where Honested's was, there was an apartment, maybe 3 or 4 stories, and my father had his office there. And I lived in the apartment and strolled along Bloor Street in Bathurst. And all that kind of information when you're young kind of is absorbed, like you're kind of like through osmosis. And I feel like I had, when I talk to other people who were born and talk about the 60s, I have this kind of big kind of, I don't know, environmental sense coming from that area because it was quite different than the suburbs. It was a downtown area. There were lots of immigrant families living in that area. And there were all these connections back to the homeland or back to some certain traditions that sort of vanished when we, went to the suburbs.
Yeah.
My father belonged to I guess you would call it, a social democratic group from the Ukraine. They
Yeah.
had created a labor temple on Bathurst Street, 300 Bathurst Street, and that was their cultural hub. And compared to the suburbs, that cultural hub had a lot of things going for it. It was like a place where people could meet and talk. They could have their social events there, but it also included language courses when my father learned Ukrainian, and they had lots of different, I guess, activities to keep the kids from not being going out and being criminals. That my aunt said they didn't want them to be criminals, so they put them downstairs and made them
You
play
leave
all
them,
these instruments
you had to dance, play instruments.
and dance and sing. And so this Ukrainian labor temple, my uncles learned to play different instruments. My dad learned to play different instruments.
Yeah.
It was a connection to like a left-wing organizations that were there, and there were a lot of politics still being talked about, and a lot of, because they were involved in music quite a bit, there were a lot of different, I would say, associations to like a different type of culture than in the suburbs, which is hockey. So they had these attachments to local musicians who had made it, or they had different attachments to members of different communities that had written things. So it was kind of, I had my ears open.
Yeah.
And many people say I'm a good listener.
Yeah.
And so I read all these stories about like the Symphony Six. In the 50s, they had a reaction against communism. As McCarthyism crept into Canada. And these six musicians, some of them were from this organization, were not allowed to go to America.
Right.
They were supposedly had communist influences. So it was kind of neat to be part of that. And my mother said that, my father was a dentist, and he would hear knocks on the door, and all his people from this 300 Bathurst would be there and say, "Oh, Dr. Rennick, I have a toothache." And, "Oh, here's the son," and they would flip me out of the air, etc.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it was like a very robust cultural place to be. And, I think of actually our grandparents. I was thinking about Dad telling me a story about how he learned about certain music, when the big bands toured and came to Toronto. So I guess Toronto too was becoming a post-war, like you said, cultural hub. Dad said his brothers would used to sneak him down when he was a teenager down to the waterfront. I think there was a music, you'd know better than me. There was a music place, and Artie Shaw might be playing, and Dad said, the brothers would sneak him over the fence, or sometimes he said he would just stay at the fence and listen to the music playing. So that idea of culture and music was so embedded, I think, into our lives, and certainly, in Toronto as well, became quite a bit of a music hub, right?
I think so. It was a kind of interesting time in downtown Toronto, because as the money kind of came in from the wealth from different mining corporations that came to Toronto, all these bars and places opened up for music and kind of celebration that the war had been over and there's this new kind of world coming.
Yeah, yeah. So okay, so you grew up in downtown Toronto pretty much. Mom always said it was over Honest Ed's, which I think is pretty cool. But you grew up in downtown Toronto. There was all this big culture around you as a kid, a lot of people from this community that was built out. And our parents also had this kind of community as well, right? They had something that they called the Bridge Group. It was a whole bunch of families that they met, as some of them as teenagers, where they would get together. And that kind of happened more when we moved to the suburbs. But, Mom and Dad at this point, it's maybe 19, I don't know what, 53, 54, I think around 54. They're in their like mid 20s with baby, you. they're building their careers, they're building their families, and they've come out of this generation where our grandmother cleaned houses for Mrs. McLaren, and our other grandparents shoemaker, and I guess our parents had this thing about like the world changing and evolving and maturing a little bit as they were. And so they bought this property in the suburbs, and you built a home and you moved to the suburbs, which must have been a real shock for you. But how do you think culturally, like that whole change with them of wanting to move to the suburbs, what do you think, or the country really? It was not the suburbs as we know it now. It was Highland Creek. It was the middle of nowhere. It was hard to get there. What do you think that was, that cultural shift, and what did that do for you?
Well, I think, it's an amazing event that really happened to our parents in that group, because I looking at some stats before World War II, only maybe 2 out of 10 students received their high school diploma.
Right, right.
And so this group of immigrants, some of them who were kind of doing menial jobs, all of a sudden went through the school system, right, and graduated, and then without their parents really encouraging them, were motivated to kind of say, I have this chance to kind of dream, to look at new things without maybe some of the baggage of the past.
Yeah.
And this dream, what is kind of maybe a Canadian dream, and we talk about the American dream, is partially about kind of looking at the past, connecting to the roots, but placing new steps and new roots in other places.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for my parents, they used to walk with me along Bathurst Street in different areas around there, and they used to say, well, we went by this house and it had a swimming pool. I heard a swimming pool in the backyard downtown Toronto.
Right.
And my mom would say, well, I would like to have a swimming pool one day, right?
Yeah.
And my father, when he was a child and a young teenager, he worked in a farm on Altona Road and loved gardening. And he saw these gardens and backyards. He said, I would like to have a big garden. And so for groups that didn't have cars before, that lived their life basically on urban transit, trolleys, right?
Yeah.
Hail, hail, the gang's all here. Let's, what do we care as long as we have the car fare? Now there was an opportunity that sort of came very quickly, that they could buy a car.
Yeah.
They could buy land, which was like one of the things that I think my parents wanted to do, and they could build a home out somewhere and look at these new kind of opportunities and dreams. So for all the group members in this bridge group that was later formed, they all came from this Eastern European group, whether they're from Polish,
Yeah.
Russian, Ukrainian immigrants, but they had this extraordinary kind of, I guess, hope. They were very positive about that hope and believed that there could be a new future developed for them and their children. And one of the places to do that was not in the crowded areas where they grew up, where they had very little green space, but in the suburbs.
Yeah. And do you think as a baby of the 50s, that lens of adventurism and exploring, maybe became part of who you are as a person just by what they did? They were sort of adventurers in many respects, weren't they? And do you think that kind of like guided you as to when you started growing up and experimenting with things and looking at life?
I think so. I think that it was a template maybe for those ideas of adventure and going beyond certain types of, if you could call them, lines of borders that they had in the past with their own lives. And it was also maybe a challenge, because I think when I was growing up in the 60s, there was a lot of ideas about doing things in a different way as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there were certain kinds of things we wanted to, maybe values that my parents had that we didn't like, and wanted to go beyond them.
Yes.
But still have that connection, I think, with their ideas and their social connections throughout our lives.
Yeah, because you were really living with a generation that was scaling their lives so quickly. I mean, they were post-war, their parents were new
Yeah.
immigrants, boom, all of a sudden they end up here. And now all of a sudden you're in Highland Creek, you're about 4 years old. I think Hurricane Hazel had just hit the city. And I think mom said, we just went out there and we drove, dad went out there and came back and we were moving. And then there
That was
was this,
such a horror story for me because he took me out there. He said, "This is our new home." It was during Hurricane Hazel. The foundation was built, the blocks were there, right, for
yeah.
the walls, but it was all filled with water. And I looked at it as a very young child. I thought, this is where I'm going to move, to this kind of flooded basement.
Yeah.
I thought, in this empty space, because it was a farmer's field.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And so, like that aspect of adventurism. But I think we've made an interesting correlation here. It's like growing up in the 60s, you said, you were trying to change sort of what was happening in the 50s a little bit, right? But in the end, the vision of both those generations was very forward thinking in how they were creating the world. But maybe culturally, from a music perspective, things you know, I'm not articulating properly, but the
Yeah.
50s music and the 40s music had a certain way of it being held together, and then sort of everything changed from that perspective quite a bit. But so tell me a little bit about, before we log off of this very first podcast, which has been really, really interesting, tell me a little bit about then that transition out to the burbs. It's 1954, 55. You've moved out to Highland Creek. You're a bit older. You have a sister, our sister KK, and soon to have a brother, I think, to Kent. But what was that like culturally for you?
It was a very challenging, I think, time for, I guess, a very young person, right? As a child. And because I remember the area that we lived in, Bloor and Bathurst, was a very kind of urban place. There were many stores around there. There were movie theaters across the road. There was Honest Ed's adjacent to us. And there were lots of urban noises, and people walking, constantly through the streets shopping or whatever. And where we moved to, which was Colonel Danforth Trail, which was the trail that was created, I think, after uh, the Federation, to kind of
Yeah,
create a route
the
to
War of 1812 or whatever.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
Kingston, yeah. It was a very, very sort of stark contrast. There was a school, Highland Creek School, and I think that's why my parents, bought the
yeah,
land near it, because we could walk over. But some of the land adjacent to us on the left side or right side was completely just a farmer's field. And then there was a small village you could walk to, which was maybe 20, 30 minutes away. But I remember we must have moved in the fall, and the winter, my father didn't have enough money for two panes of glass. So there was
right.
only one pane of glass,
Wow, I
and it
didn't
was
know
a
that.
very extreme cold
Oh,
winters. All the all the windows were
wow.
always Jack Frost covered with this frost. And of course, walking downtown, you had a pavement,
Yeah.
but their sidewalks weren't really constructed
Gravel.
like that. And I remember, dressed up, all wrapped up with my boots and my clothing tucked in, and I felt like I was like on the moon in this chubby outfit, sweating pursuit, trying to move around in this very, very cold areas. Things would freeze over. There would be ponds on the side of the road, and you'd have to watch out. And then walking all the way to the village, which was like 30 minutes instead of walking across the road, was a kind of experience, because it kind of, there's this kind of fun thing that Torontonians joke about, I guess later on in the 70s, they called it Scarborough, because it
Yeah,
was like Siberia.
Siberia.
It felt a little bit like that, right? In the
Yeah,
wintertime.
yeah.
Uh, so I did feel a little bit of, which we say, isolation. And I don't know if I should talk to my analyst about this a little bit, of maybe trauma in the adjustment from the urban
Yeah,
to this kind of suburban, because at that time we lived in a suburban area, but it wasn't really like a suburban area developed by
like
a corporation.
farms.
It was
Yeah,
people built their homes and then lived in this
yeah.
kind of country area.
Yeah. And so did you culturally then, because it sounds like you were in this vibrant kind of community in the city and then you came out to the country and then of course there's the aspect of cultural like television. So was that era of television there and kind of, did you have that with mom and dad? Did that influence you? Because we didn't really have this one written, but I was just thinking about that. There's that kind of the rural
No,
isolation, but then where did you get like your signals around arts, culture, and I guess what was happening in the world?
so yeah, I mean the thing with the beginning, the end of 19, the 50s, right? The 59, etc. There was a shift to change the idea of what was to come.
Yeah.
Part of it was television, and there was a big controversy in Highland Creek where we live because the television represented an unknown kind of technology.
Right.
Some people in the neighborhood would not let their children watch television because
Right.
it was a mesmerizing boob tube, they called it,
Yeah.
that it was going to drain intellectual capacity away. Um, and the other thing about which sort of changed in the suburbs from downtown, we lived in an apartment. There was no like private space.
Right.
Just like we have coffee shops today, the rec room became
Yeah.
the third space in the suburban home.
Yeah.
And the rec room was a place where you would have your television, maybe your hi-fi set or other, and a couch and cushions, where you could then have this alternative space to gather information. Now, although there were maybe 3 channels, I can't remember. The CBC went online, and you could wait up in the morning to look at the images that turned from what is it called? The image of, I think it was a First Nations person that changed
Yeah.
into the different shows. It was a way to connect to the outside world, and I think that and a number of other things made our world seem different than our parents. So I
Yeah.
remember going to one of those bridge group things, and they were talking about the Sputnik,
Yeah. Yeah.
because the Sputnik was a major change, I think, for myself, because now there was actually a satellite going around the world,
Yeah.
and it made the world kind of feel different, smaller, right?
Yeah.
Uh, on television, it was sort of interesting. You could watch, the news, and you could watch news that
Yeah.
was from different areas, and there would be reporters. And again, you felt like the world was somehow a lot smaller. The connections between families sometimes became over television programs, a Howdy Doody show, Captain Kangaroo, the Walt Disney, Disneyland, kind of things. You watch those, and because there are only 3 channels, everybody would talk about them in the
Yeah.
community, right? And
Yeah.
so your community sometimes arose from the media
That
that was
media.
there. It's funny for me because while the Sputnik, was going around, there were shows like Lassie, Dog,
Yeah.
Home, Family, Nuclear Family, that was kind of very traditional. Yet, another year after, there was actually a dog in space,
Yeah.
Laika,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so you have these extremes of like things which were very conservative, and yet this new kind of thing that like Flash Gordon, I could be going into space. We
Right.
watched Gordon on television. Now there was a dog in space, but where was it going to, then the next step would be there would be like a human in space. And so there was this kind of, I would
Yeah.
say, uh, large optimism or change from my parents, where they just had radios, on the table,
Yeah.
to this thing that was moving at a very fast, rapid rate, in regards to that. So some of the culture did come from television, and I think now in retrospect, I think a lot of it influenced us, but in ways, there was this great idea of also commercialism, that was coming out of the
Yeah.
50s, because the mothers could buy these huge, like
Yeah.
large appliances. But for children were looked differently. Like my parents, I never thought really had like media gifts from the media that was playing on, right? So radio, but we did. So for example, there was a Davy Crockett show.
Yeah, I remember
Davy,
that.
Davy Crockett, King of the Wild
Yeah,
from now, and he wore this cap with the coonskin hat, right?
yeah,
And that, I don't know, became like a media kind of viral,
yeah,
uh, what should we say, thing, that object that everybody had to have, all boys had to have. And so uh, it went viral, and every store had to have all these caps,
yeah,
and he wore them. The Mickey Mouse hats, that went viral. Um, Teenagers, I looked at a distance. I didn't really understand them because too much, but they looked also to have a different world because they had their own costumes on. The women wore these very tight cashmere sweaters,
yeah,
had certain kinds of makeup, etc., and clothing. And they, when we went to different restaurants, tended to clump together and talk and have certain types of drinks together, like milkshakes and
yeah,
hamburgers. So there was this whole different kind of like consumer culture thing
yeah.
for children and also for teenagers,
Yeah. So it's like
right?
a whole cultural shift and change at that time in the 50s. The 50s must have been an incredible decade to grow up in for that reason. And especially your shift from this vibrant city to
Yeah.
this very rural area. So let's talk a little bit about what was happening in Toronto. So I researched it. So in the late 50s, and I know this because mom used to talk about going to see Camelot, leaving me at home as a 6 week old or an 8 week old baby and going to see Bob Goulet and in Camelot at the O'Keefe Center. So Toronto now started having, I guess, this cultural epiphany, and they built this huge hall called the O'Keefe Center. It's still around. I think it's called the Meridian Center. It had Alabama limestone in it, bronze detailing. It had 3,200 seats, so big like you were almost talking about the Mickey Mouse stuff, this big spectator opportunity. And they were building this to launch this, Richard Burton, Julie Andrews, Camelot in October. It opened October 1st of 1960. So let's go back to you. December 31st, I'm getting goosebumps. 1959, the boy in the striped suit. So what were your thoughts on that in that 1959 New Year's Eve with your grandparents and this whole Russian Ukrainian community, but also noticing these shifts? And maybe just to wrap up this podcast one, what were your thoughts?
My thoughts dancing in that, uh, I think it was a basement party.
Yeah, it was.
I was very happy to see my grandparents enjoying their time in the basement dancing. The music, though, was all, I guess, Slavic, Russian,
Yeah,
Ukrainian music, and there were polkas. And I know my grandmother on my father's side, Kay, she was dancing polka with Rafim, and they were whirling and whirling around. And so, when I think about it now, I think about the changes because, in 1959, there were lots of things that were happening to go forward. So I know that the new city hall, looking for a new city hall, and they had a public kind of discussions about it, and they opened it up to the world to look for an architect. That was something new. The National Ballet of Canada was started around maybe a little bit before by actually this Russian Boris Volkov and another group. And my father and mother had seen a ballet from Boris Volkov. And so that was there. And they talked a little bit about that sometimes in their discussions in this bridge group about what cultural things were happening. And this modern kind of idea of the Sputnik, the round, sleek
yeah,
object flying through the, and then the city hall with its spaceship
yeah,
there, and then the O'Keefe Center with its big cement
yeah.
overhang
Cantilever. Yeah,
levered up over, where large limousines could pull in,
yeah,
and women and men who dressed up in their finery could go to see uh, Camelot.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, it kind of reverberated with my grandmother and her partner dancing this polka, and then these other things happening in Toronto,
yeah,
uh, cultural things to kind of expand it. Because I was reading that a little bit too about changes in the 50s. They said in 1951, there were only 14 new novels published in Canada.
Wow. Wow.
Only 14. And there was like, when they did this, commission, they did all these white paper commissions. They said, well, wow, like this is really a problem because we
Yeah.
have all this money coming in, but
Yeah.
we're not spending it on culture.
Yeah.
So that government, I think, which was liberal before Diefenbaker, created the Canada Council to
Right.
sponsor these things, and put money into the Governor General's awards, which then became, more literary and more different awards from
Yeah.
that. And so I think Canada sometimes felt a little bit like behind the times after the war, and they just like with this kind of idea of being modern, whatever modern meant, it was somehow they lacked those things. And so there was this great impetus to kind of move forward over the past Victorian age that kind of was there in Toronto to create this new music, this new dance, this new architecture, and kind of maybe a new kind of society.
Yeah. So
So
it was a really
it,
transformative time for this country and for anybody living in this country.
it was the other part of it, which is sort of a yin yang, was that 1959 was like 58 or 9, can't remember. John Diefenbaker had a huge majority. He was a conservative,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
and there were things there which were sort of both positive and negative. The first woman who was in cabinet, Faircloth, she was the first woman who was actually a minister in his government. On the other hand, there was this Red Scare.
Yeah.
So there was this question like, are we going to have missile defense systems
Yeah.
placed over our head? And there were starting groups in Canada to link with the British groups about like ban the bomb kind of movement,
Yeah.
because there was this fear of like we are a much smaller world, so therefore the armies can't come over here, but these huge missiles could. So there was, I think, some anxiety there about those things that were happening. So there was this kind of a bit of splintering, like between this kind of love of like this newness, right? This new modern age, but then there are those kind of things that you look and you didn't see, like this idea of the, I guess the race, the bomb race, etc.,
Yeah.
whatever it's called.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of, I would think, a challenging, scary thing for a kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
In
Well,
fact, later on in the 60s, we did Duck and Cover, right?
yeah.
So but it was just sort of at the beginning of that, but you could
Yeah.
feel that kind of, abrasiveness
Yeah.
from the politics.
All right. Well, this is a very interesting way to end our first podcast together. Brother, won't you talk to me? Thank you for talking to me, brother. This has been incredibly enlightening. We could do this probably for hours more and more, but I want to start us preparing for podcast 2, which is entitled Sunshine, Lollipops, Rainbows, and Living in Color. And I'm looking forward to discussing all the things about 1960s onward. Of course, my birth year, part of it. It's a good one. But
Hey,
it's been amazing talking to you today, Rob. Thank you so much.
thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk and discussion. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to this podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to and watching Brother Won't You Talk to Me. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.